Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We will crack on. The more astute of you, or amongst you, will have noticed that I am not Harry Greenfield. Harry Greenfield, who was supposed to be chairing this session, has got stuck in traffic. So in his stead, my name is Mark Riches. I am the Regional Director for the CLA in the Midlands region. So I will be standing in for Harry this morning. As a result of that, I'm slightly less prepared than he was. So if I appear to be looking at notes, that's because I am. So please bear with me. So we're here today this morning to talk about biodiversity net gain, and hopefully some of you have an idea of what biodiversity net gain is and what it means. But in terms of sort of where we stand with it at the moment, biodiversity net gain, or BNG, as we will probably be referring to it throughout, just to make it easier for ourselves, will be mandatory on most developments by late next year, so late 2023. It will be measured using DEFRA's biodiversity metric, which will establish what the biodiversity value of a particular site is, how damage can be avoided, or the developers will have to give an overview of how damage can be avoided, where it can't be avoided, how it can be mitigated or can be offset. The idea is that it will ideally be delivered on site, or where that can't be the case, it can be delivered on land nearby, or potentially credits can be bought for it. Where you're undertaking biodiversity net gain work, it will have to be in place for a minimum period of 30 years. So that's something that I think we'll be talking about a bit later on, and how the importance of why that may impact people's management decisions when they are entering these agreements. The policy of biodiversity net gain is still in development at the moment, but local planning authorities, advisors, brokers are currently building in capacity so that when this policy does come to us early next year, we will make sure that we're in a good place to be delivering this biodiversity net gain. And I think it's important to say that it must be when we're talking about biodiversity net gain, it must be genuine. It must genuinely contribute towards nature recovery, because it's in no one's interest for corners to be cut and for the policy not to work. As part of this, it's vital to ensure that there is enough land available. We need to make sure that by the time this policy is in place, there is land available there, and genuine biodiversity net gain agreements can be put in place. You'll have noticed over the last few years that there is a trend towards greater financial incentives for new environmental markets, both coming from the government, from the private sector, and from society more widely. And from a CLA point of view, we feel it's vital to ensure that biodiversity net gain complements other markets that are available. That would include the carbon markets, the environmental land management schemes that are coming down the road, and water quality, just by way of example. So I will shut up, and we'll talk to two people that actually know what they're talking about. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Emma Toovey, who's the Ecology Director from the Environment Bank. So Emma.
Brilliant, thanks Mark, and hi everyone, nice to be here today. So yeah, I'm the Ecology Director at Environment Bank. You might have seen our very bold and blue stand over if you want to come and talk to us later today. So I manage a team of ecologists. And Environment Bank, it's actually been around for quite a few years now, since 2006 when David Hill, our founder, established the business. And historically we've been involved in working with developers, helping them to deliver ecological mitigation off-site away from their development projects. But now we have a new model, which is essentially to establish habitat banks. And Toby is one of our landowners, going to talk to you a bit about that shortly. But essentially, in a nutshell, a habitat bank offers a solution off-site for developers. So Mark mentioned that developers need to seek to deliver their biodiversity net gain on-site within their red line boundary as much as they possibly can. But the reality is when they've got 100 houses to deliver and there's limited space within their red line, the reality is that being able to deliver biodiversity within that red line is quite challenging. So they need to look for solutions off-site. So we offer one of those solutions for them. So we're creating habitat banks. So we're setting up essentially habitat creation projects all over England, at least one in every local planning authority area across England in the next 2 to 3 years. So we're talking 300, 400 habitat creation projects across England. These projects, these habitat banks, essentially, the first key thing for us is that they're done at scale. So we're not looking at small piecemeal bits and bobs across the landscape. We're looking to deliver large-scale projects that are a minimum of 10 hectares, but up to and beyond 100 hectares. We're looking at a site next week that's 230 hectares, so big scale, so that we can really deliver nature recovery in a meaningful and tangible way. The other aspect of our projects is that they're fully forward funded and secured for the full lifetime, which is 30 years, as Mark suggested, and that's mandated in law. That's why it has to be 30 years. So we will, I'm sure, have questions on that. Something exciting is going on over there. But stay here, this is fun. Very good. So yeah, our projects are fully funded and secured for their full lifetime from day one. So as a landowner, they receive rental payments, and we contract back the management services. All of that funding's fully secure. So in the terrible event in 10 years' time that EB, for example, went bust, all of that money is sort of in a escrow-type bank account from day one. So all of that money's there. So that's really, really key. And if you're looking at other providers, you should be asking those sorts of questions. The other aspect is what we're trying to deliver, and what's really key is that we're seeking land which is low biodiversity value to start with. So agricultural land, but also low productivity. So it's not generating a great income for the landowner currently, and they're seeking to look for other options, other income streams, where it's essentially not giving them the yield or the income that they need. So that sort of marginal land's perfect for us. And what we do is we co-create a habitat management plan with the landowner so that it's appropriate for them and also delivers the ecology that we need. We co-create it with the landowner and deliver an uplift, an improvement in biodiversity value. Then, using the brilliant metric that Mark's mentioned that's been designed by DEFRA, we can essentially quantify that uplift into biodiversity units. That's the product, and that can then be sold to the developer. So in our model, we essentially pay the landowner to lease their land. We take a long-term lease. We also pay the landowner, and it's competitive with sort of solar farm type payments, up to around £800, £900 per hectare per year. That's it, the rental and the management all in. Then we essentially own the units and we can sell them to the developer. So that's a model. But I want to make sure we've got loads of time for Toby to talk about his experience as the landowner.
Thanks. Hi everybody. So thanks, Emma. My name's Toby Diggens. I've got a little farm down in Devon, which me and my wife Bella run, and I'm also a landscape architect. I run a studio called Diggens Co. You have to excuse my voice; it might crack up. Been working and playing a bit hard. But anyway, So the farm down in Devon basically is a pasture farm completely, and the backstory that will bring us on to the idea of why we used Biodiversity Net Gain is that when me and my wife moved back to the farm, it's my wife's parents' farm really. We saw that essentially sort of ecology, which is a massive part of what I do, and part of almost my sort of nature, was exceptionally low, and given the biodiversity crisis, as you want to call it, and the absolutely fabulous habitats that actually the sort of area of Devon that we're in, a place called Witheridge, which is quite near Tiverton, we realised that actually no matter what we wanted to do to the land from a farming perspective, we were never going to be able to make a particularly large amount of money, no matter how many cattle we had, no matter how much inputs we wanted to throw at the land. We would never, on 110 acres, be able to sort of make a living, as it were. And of course, being a landscape architect, and running my own business, we don't necessarily need that land to produce for the purpose of actually putting food on the table. And as a consequence, the land itself that we manage, which is now in a sort of period of restoration, is essentially a bit of a laboratory for me and my wife to explore how we still create incredibly nutrient-dense and fabulous food, but with wildlife and nature at the very heart of what we do. And so over the sort of 4 to 5 years that this journey has been in play, we've used lots of different techniques, including working with the Devon Wildlife Trust to restore areas of calm grassland, which is this beautifully special landscape, which the higher landscapes of Devon are renowned for. We're over the top of very, very impermeable clay. And as a consequence, these amazingly sort of orchid-rich, tussocky grasslands develop if you allow the landscapes to be what they want to be. We're particularly surrounded by intensive silage, which from my perspective is quite sad because you're seeing a lot more inputs going in day to day, and obviously the cost of those inputs is going up. And actually, one of the most distressing things from my perspective is that the particular area that we live in is dominated by biodigesters, and so we have a lot of maize that grows and a lot of silage that doesn't actually go into feeding cattle. It goes straight into the biodigesters. And unfortunately, our water quality and things like that is enormously suffering. And that brings me on to the story of Puddington Moor, which during the pandemic, basically, this 25-acre field, so 10 hectares, came up for sale semi-privately. There's just a little sign on the side of the road saying "Field for sale," and it's not contiguous to our farm, but every single year we watched thousands of tons of topsoil come down this little brook called the Hensford Brook, and we just thought, what can we do to try and stabilise the landscape, which essentially every winter is just disappearing in front of our eyes. And the more you know, the more you learn what's going on, and the more you actually see. And when I talk about seeing, we all see lots of things, but as you start to engage with the understanding of landscape, you really start to see what things are going on. And so from what I thought was just a river at the bottom of our farm, I started to consider, well, how come that river is 9 foot into the ground, like a canyon? And I realized that actually what's been happening over the last probably 200 years is that intensive drainage of land and also the erosion of the soil and the destruction of its structure has essentially incised that river, because every single time we have a rainstorm, everything goes to the river within about 25 minutes. And Puddington Moor sits basically on the watershed of the Exe catchment and the Tor catchment, two magical rivers Henry Williamson wrote about, and obviously, as you may or may not know, they were absolutely full of salmon once upon a time, which they're now not, mainly because of the problems that I just talked about, as well as, unfortunately, diffuse pollution. So Puddington Moor sits right at the top of this watershed. And of course, knowing what I now know, if you can stabilise the head of streams, it's a huge win for landscape in general. You're going to deliver beautiful quality water downstream. And unfortunately, if obviously there's somebody on the stream edge that's not doing the right things, that can quite quickly send it the wrong way. But we thought, at least if it's starting clear, then maybe it stays clear for a bit longer. So we bought Puddington Moor. Just have some water. Thanks. We bought Puddington Moor, and we wanted immediately to restore it. But my wife Bella and I bought it, at risk. So we took out a mortgage, which cost us about £900 a month to service. And so immediately I was thinking, well, how are we going to make this pay? Because otherwise we're just going to have to pay for it out of some other income stream. And it was at that point that I was exploring Biodiversity Net Gain. I also work on other sorts of landscape scale projects, one of which is called the Wenling Beck Environment Project in Norfolk. It's a 2,000 acre habitat restoration project which is using natural capital funding to actually deliver this large-scale restoration, which is a hybrid of essentially sort of renaturalizing landscapes and regenerative farming. And so all the time I was hearing biodiversity net gain, biodiversity net gain. And I actually also worked with other landscape architects and ecologists on delivering biodiversity net gain on site in developments in Cornwall, where the councils there have actually adopted biodiversity net gain as a thing for quite a long time. So I started searching around, and it was actually an ex-colleague of Emma's, a guy called Richard Wheat, who turned up and sort of started to put forward the idea of what the Environment Bank was offering. And after a couple of other offers from local developers and local council who were doing road widening and were trying to get slightly ahead of when the law came in, we realised that actually, above and beyond anything else, we really wanted to work with the Environment Bank, because they shared a very similar model to the kind of thinking that we had. And I always think that if you find people in life who are very similar to you, then you should work with them, because that's the relationship that matters. And we've gone through all of the sort of legals and everything, but what we feel is that we know that landscapes are flexible. We know that we're going to want to manage them differently over the 30 years, and I believe that that these guys are going to help us do that. And so the vision for us is to basically restore Puddington Moor, this 25-acre field, to a species-rich landscape that's managed by our cattle. And we mob graze our cattle and holistically manage them. And I'll definitely ask that if anybody's ever coming past the link road up to Barnstaple, please do drop in, because the results are pretty awesome. And so that's it. So basically, we're now in the process of restoring it. And this year we're going to do species-rich hay spreading. We're going to start. We're doing something really cool, which is a bit innovative maybe, but this idea of myco-restoration, so using mycelial mats to actually restore forestry much faster than you would get if you're trying to restore off an arable field, because none of the mycelium in an arable field actually correlate with what you have under trees. And as you probably heard from lots of other talks, I think actually Merlin Sheldrake's here today talking about fungi. They are a massive element that we've completely forgotten. And so we're actually going to pre-inoculate the soil with mycelium and forest fungi from an organic mushroom producer, using local mushrooms to actually try and boost the speed of woody vegetation, as well as having mainly an open area for breeding curlew and lapwing to return in a place where they once were really prevalent. So that's our story, and I don't think we'd be where we are today if we hadn't secured this finance. It essentially pays for the mortgage, if you want to look at it like that. Not quite. We'll still have to sell a few more cows, but it should work, hopefully. And yeah, that's about it.
Wonderful, thank you. One of the things I've just picked up on you mentioning was production of high quality food. From some of the literature I've read and some of the sort of people I've spoken to, there often seems to be the opinion that it's biodiversity net gain or food, or it's environmental schemes or food. Yeah. How do you find the relationship between the environmental works you're doing and the production of high quality food? Because clearly they aren't mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
Start with you, Toby, and then Emma. It'd be interesting to see what your sort of wider client base thinks about it.
It's an epic question, because
thank you very much. I've just come up with it myself. So.
Yeah. It's on the tip of everyone's tongues, isn't it? What are we going to do with our food? Oh my God! I always think it's quite funny to think that there's 14 million, wildebeest on the Serengeti, and if it gets to 15 million, then it pairs back to 14 million. So sort of food scarcity, quite good at sort of controlling everything. But basically, high quality food is paramount to us all having a lovely life, and we couldn't grow cereals or any kind of crop that would yield for us for long enough that we wouldn't end up having to go down the chemical route, which is desperately bad for ecology, as far as I've studied. And as a consequence, what we can do is grow incredible cattle on incredibly nature-rich landscapes, because we use the native breed, the North Devon or Red Devon, and they absolutely love eating rushes and tussocks and willow scrub, and of course, therefore, your inputs go radically down. And my view is that with our landscapes, we could produce that food for eternity if the weather wasn't to change or some other massive factor was to come into it. And so I see that as a huge thing for us, is that if we can deliver X number of cattle per year to the markets, to people's plates, as well as delivering ultra high quality landscape and biodiversity, then that's proper. And where Biodiversity Net Gain works for that is that you don't have to stop farming, as it were. You know, lots of places where there's species-rich pasture being managed by herds of cattle, and we all still call it agriculture, and it's exactly the same. So you know, it works for us because we can still have our farming model that we have over the rest of the land. So that's good.
Yeah, completely agree, Toby. And I think my perspective, I think there are a few areas here. I mean, first of all, the percentage of land that's going to be needed for biodiversity net gain is going to be sort of, 1% of the farmland annually, a really small percentage. I think they can absolutely be delivered in combination. It's not going to be a competition for land. I mentioned earlier, we're looking for that marginal land, that land that is the lower productivity land, the land that isn't delivering, that is struggling to make an income for landowners, and that's the land that we want to restore and bring nature recovery to the fore. I'm an ecologist, but I would also argue that if we do restore our landscapes and bring the nature back, that will also probably improve conditions for food production as well, and we will see the natural capital assets and all of the benefits that come from natural capital will also improve our food productivity in the surrounding land that is being used for food production.
Thank you. Move on to a question about timescales. Obviously, we mentioned 30 years is the minimum requirement. For a lot of people, that's quite a scary prospect to potentially tie your land up, not just potentially your land, but the land that belongs to your children, for quite a significant period of time. Clearly, that's a requirement under the Biodiversity Net Gain legislation, and that's going to be something that is not movable. But how do you address people's fears when it comes to that time period? And from your point of view, Toby, how did you feel when it came to entering a 30-year agreement? Was it scary?
Terrifying.
Thanks, Toby. It's actually interesting. So I completely get it. 30 years is a huge amount of time. And I think actually, though, we're getting a mix. So definitely those people are like, seriously, does it have to be 30 years? But also we're getting a lot of landowners that like that security, 30 years of a fixed, healthy income per hectare. They know what's coming. It's secured for a full 30 years. They can tell their kids, don't worry, at least you got that coming in. In 10 years' time, who knows what the climate's going to be doing and food production and government subsidies, crikey, who on earth knows? But at least you've got that. And so I think that security actually is really appealing. So it's a balance. I mean, if I could change the 30 years, I would, but I can't. So it is what it is.
And I think it's also important to bear in mind the goals of individual land managers and farmers as well, because we at the CLA, we quite regularly get asked questions, how can I make money from my land? And the first question I always go back with is, what do you want to do with your land? Because, people talk about, I think glamping is a great idea. And then you go back to them and say, well, do you like dealing with people? Do you like customers? Oh, no, I hate people. Well, then it's probably not the thing for you, despite the fact that you may think you may make some income from it. If you despise doing it, then it just won't work. So I'm imagining it's the same with Biodiversity Net Gain. You've got to have people who are very open-minded, who want to do this type of thing. And I think the example of Groundswell is a prime example of a group of people coming together, all of whom have a fairly shared mindset with what they want to do with their business. So there's lots here for people to learn about. So come and talk to these guys afterwards, who know far more than me. Don't ask me any questions. I will come to questions at the end if that's okay. So please hold it. I'll come to you most definitely. Next question, which I've forgotten what it was supposed to be. I did write it down. as they say, bear with.
I'll just take on the 30-year thing as well, because I obviously, made a funny joke, but it's not actually that terrifying. Probably wasn't actually a funny joke. But 30 years for us, because I'm fairly young, didn't seem an overburdening prospect. And of course, there are management agreements and the lease, which you have to sign for there to be at least some ability for the Environment Bank to, in the sort of, let's say, for example, that we just became completely negligent and just couldn't be bothered to manage the land the way that the management plan was set out to be done, which because of the way it works, puts the Environment Bank at risk, because essentially we are creating the biodiversity units that are then sold by the Environment Bank to the developer. And to just roll back a little bit more on that, one can, if they want, go about doing this by themselves. They can open up a dialogue with a local developer or a council and go about trying to sell their own units. And if you're ecologically minded or you're a consultant already and you have some land, then arguably that is one way of doing it. But of course, in our scenario, we also then want to manage that land. And after working on the Wenling Beck project, I saw the amount of work that was required to actually get to a point of what we called on that project market readiness. So when you actually understand how many biodiversity units you technically could create. So we made this master plan, which was then set against a baseline of ecological sort of appraisal of the landscape. And then the master plan basically said, we're going to create this number of biodiversity units over and above the baseline number of units that are already there. And so all of that got done over a period of actually nearly 2 years. It's a big project. It's 2,000 acres. It's nothing like the 10 hectares of Puddington. But the amount of consultative time that went into it, including my own, as well as the amount of time that actually I have spent personally working with the Environment Bank, probably ends up meaning that all of the extra income or margin that you'd have made over and above just sort of taking a more brokered third-party arrangement would have been lost in the amount of work that you'd have had to do to get you there. And if you've got a lot of free time, you could arguably say, well, that's better for me. You might get a better deal, you might not. And actually at the moment, arguably, there is not many people out there who would, I think, offer what the Environment Bank can offer at the moment, given that they have this investment up behind them to front load the market. And so for us, it seemed like a really logical thing, because then once we signed up for the 30 years, because ecology and restoration doesn't just work in tomorrow, it's not like putting a wheat crop in at the end of the summer, you get your wheat back. We want to try and restore marsh fritillaries, which require very specific types and tussocks of millennia combined with their food plant, which is Devil's Bit scabious. And you can't recreate that in a year, no matter how much time and energy you put into it, unless you had so much money you could actually plant the whole landscape with tussocks that were big enough. It's absolutely impossible. And so actually, for us, the 30 years look like security, because we know it's going to take us a decade to even get to some level of high-quality biodiversity, and it'll probably then take us another decade to get to the point where we can reintroduce marsh fritillaries, and then probably another decade until we actually see curlews and lapwings returning, because we need this unbelievably interconnected set of habitats to all start working properly for the water table to come back up to the surface like it should, which it doesn't at the moment. If you walk the landscape at the moment, it's just got these 5-inch wide cracks across it because it's been hammered by intensive ploughing, deep ploughing, more deep ploughing, power harrowing, root crops, root crop. And so the soil slumps and it just sits like a piece of cement. It's amazing when you go up to the field at the moment. There's literally areas in mid-Devon on the top of a hill where you should have basically bogs. The whole thing is burned off because of 5 days of dry. And that's the kind of thing that you'd be battling against as a farmer to try and make a crop come out of that. So the 30-year thing for us seemed like an incredibly strong rationale to go for, Of course, there are those pieces in the agreements that everybody's going to see if you do it, where you'll be like, don't know about that. And of course, there's the question of agricultural property relief, which I'm sure everybody's asking about. Ask the question at the end, we can talk about it. But we'll be in our 60s when the term gives over, comes to an end, and so it just seemed like a good choice.
Thank you. In terms of biodiversity net gain, how can it be combined with other income streams? So clearly, within a diversified farming business, rural business, it's important to have a diversified income stream to protect against shocks and things. But how have you sort of implemented it into your diversified rural business? And then how do you find most of your clients work when it comes to making it work with their other income streams, their other business activities as well?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing is that in most cases, we're not taking all of the land from a landowner. It's a proportion of their wider land holding. And so when we're developing that habitat management plan, deciding what's going to be created where, how it's going to be managed, that's very much a co-creation process. So we work with the landowner to understand the practicalities of their land. They know their land better than anyone else, and we make sure that we're delivering the habitats that they want on the land as well. So that's the first thing. So it's very much slotted into their wider, farm plan, if you like. The other thing is that our legal structures are designed to bring as much flexibility so that the landowner retains that sort of management control. So in terms of accessing other income streams through, stewardship, for example, we can make that work where it's compatible, and wherever possible we will work with the landowner to make sure that every opportunity for wider income streams through other funding is possible. There are absolutely, though, let's be clear, some incompatibilities. So you can't get paid by us to deliver beautiful habitats and then get funding for exactly the same habitat creation and management through other means. So
Spoil sport.
Yes, it's that. No double dipping. But there are still other opportunities for funding, and we do everything we can through our legal structures to make that accessible for the landowner, and we don't want, we wouldn't be seeking to sort of take them for us, if you like, as the leaseholder.
Yeah, so probably the best way I can answer this is to go back into the landscape architecture mode, which is that when we come to design a landscape, we always start with where we can as robust a kind of vision of the future as we can physically get to. And with our clients, that's exactly what we do. So there's this very, very powerful knowledge of where you want to head to. And I think that is exactly where I would say one needs to start with thinking about biodiversity net gain, is that at the moment there are lots and lots of different opportunities, many of which you can find out about all around here today. And many of them are a bit of a head-scratcher still. Many of them are a bit unknown. And as a consequence, it's the people who have a very strong vision of where their farmland and their holdings want to go that I think will be able to make the most amount of or take the best benefits from these additional sort of payments other than cash crops, for example. And that's where I feel like the natural capital payments are important. And that's why I feel it's also very important to essentially master plan the vision of your landscape, because what you can then do is go, right, we now know what we want over this larger scale farming system. And obviously at the same time as doing master planning visually, you should do financial planning so that you understand what income streams you might want to get, what stuff you might want to lock up for the long term where you get payments that are just coming in that are all the same, where you might want to take a bit more risk and get payments that are based on growing trees or, and I'm talking about growing timber, for example, not growing trees for carbon, but I suppose you could do that as well. How much you want to do with livestock and how much you want to do with arable, for example. And that all then starts to paint a picture for you that you can start to understand. And it's at that point that I think you can do the single dip, where you go and you go, right, this land is for example, what works well with Biodiversity Net Gain, given what the metric offers you. I'm not necessarily sure that it's perfect for this, and I think we should push to actually, this is a side note, but we should push to create something in the biodiversity metric that allows for high quality landscapes to be restored or preserved, and the same payments made to people who are also restoring from very poor landscapes. And as a consequence, this is where I think you can say, right, we've got this arable field here, the yields are dropping. You know, the topsoil's this deep, and actually looking at it ecologically, that would be an ideal restoration field where a species-rich grassland would actually start to restore the soil as well as create a great place for some wildlife on your farm. And then, as you're going through this process, you can start to piece that puzzle together until that vision that you've had from the beginning starts to take shape. And it's not going to happen immediately, because if you've got 1,000 acres, you need to concentrate on the 10 hectares or the 100 hectares that you're restoring. You need to think about it deeply, because if you leave it alone, it's going to go in the wrong direction, or it's going to take you off in the wrong direction, or you're not going to get what you want out of it. And so you should see it as potentially a sort of life journey to just slowly but surely restore or not, or grow, or however you want to do on your land, because then you'll be able to see this like more holistic framework of your landscape all working in the jigsaw puzzle of what you want to create. And I think most importantly, there absolutely isn't a way to do it. There literally is no way. You have to create your own way. No one's going to be able to tell you what to do on your land, because every single piece of land is so unbelievably specific. And the deeper you understand it, the more you notice that. So I think that's how I would go about it.
Thank you. Now, with all these things, you can't get away from paperwork, and clearly it's very important for us to keep the legal profession employed. So what legal agreements need to be in place? And sort of following on from that, how are these monitored? What is the monitoring process? What is the, for want of a better word, inspection process? And what is the liability for those within these schemes if, for example, certain elements are not met? I'll let you take that one first.
Big questions there, Mark. Thank you. Okay, so legal agreements. So the first sort of relationship is us and the landowner. So we have a lease agreement, which is for the 30 years, and that's a typical kind of property type lease agreement. And then there's also that, when I sort of talked about contracting back those habitat management services, so those extra payments are all about managing the land. So then there's a habitat management type agreement as well. So those are the two agreements between us and the landowner. In addition to that, we as Environment Bank, in order to sell the biodiversity units, we then have either a conservation covenant, which is a legal agreement that's coming to the fore in the autumn this year from government, a conservation covenant, or the alternative is a Section 106 agreement. And we have to sign up to that with a local authority. And that essentially, the local authority are then the responsible body, and they can enforce against us as Environment Bank. We take on that risk. They can enforce against us to make sure that we're delivering what we've committed to do through the sale of those biodiversity units for developers. So what we do, and this is fully funded again by Environment Bank, we have to do annual monitoring and survey work of the sites to see how the habitats are being established, if they're performing, if things are going a bit awry, do we need to intervene and, to help Toby to change maybe the management actions, and we do something a bit different. So we do that annually. It's a kind of fluid and live process, the management. And then we report back against that to the local authority, who are a responsible body, to say, yes, we're doing everything we said we would and everything's going to plan. So that's the kind of legal context. Does that?
No, that's brilliant. And just you should have mentioned annual monitoring inspections. Toby, how does that compare to an inspection by the RPA?
What inspection? Yeah, probably they're here now. They're like, right, we'll go straight to Mid-Devon and get you. We are doing all the right things.
I suppose what I'm really after is just assurances, of which I'm quite sure is the case.
Yeah, that's
fine. It's a very cooperative approach.
Yeah.
And
it is
very different to maybe the experiences that people will have had when it comes to inspections from certain other bodies.
Well, so far we haven't done anything wrong, so who knows what happens. But basically, as Emma was saying, we will be. I wouldn't actually say it's inspected. It's like monitored, because the idea of ecology obviously is that it goes through fits and starts as it restores itself. And of course, like Emma was saying, we will have to adapt our management plan to suit. I think more broadly, because I believe that these guys are going to do a good job of it, which is why we ended up going with them. The process of monitoring is, as far as I see Biodiversity Net Gain, currently a bit of the blackest hole that we have, because I don't believe that the LPAs currently are going to be able to spend the time going out to look at these sites, and I don't necessarily know just yet whose responsibility it is to then get third-party ecologists to go out and do that. So I think that will probably come to the fore, but again, I think it's also to some extent the responsibility of the landowner from more of a morality perspective, to recognise that what you're being paid for, if you look back, is the loss of biodiversity, which has been being lost through development and other practices on land for generations without any form of payback, as it were. So if you wanted to see Biodiversity Net Gain as a certain type of thing, it essentially is now mandating us all to try to restore what we take away with other necessities like building houses for people. And I do think that is a step in the right direction. I know there's probably plenty of people who aren't necessarily sold on the concept of financially incentivizing the restoration of biology, because it's never been like that before. But it has been destroyed, and so this is a step in the right direction to it actually being saved, if you want to look at it like that. And
the point I suppose I wanted to make is that people mustn't view inspection or monitoring in the way that they would do from government organisations. This is very much a collaborative approach. It's about working together to produce something positive. And when we're talking about the barriers earlier, what are the barriers? People mustn't see that as a barrier, because actually it isn't.
Totally, and just to reinforce that point, so our management fees are paid on actions, not outcomes. So, it's a really uncertain climate. 30 years is a long time. Who knows things are gonna look like in 10 years' time? And there's a period of drought, and the grass is failing. That isn't a risk that sits with the landowner. That's a risk that sits with us. We identify that with the landowner. We go onto site, we do the surveys, and we're like, crikey, that's not going to plan, and we adapt the management accordingly. And any additional capital works that we might need to do again, that all sits with us. So it absolutely is not an inspection. It's a collaborative.
Absolutely.
process.
I do have some more questions, but I'm quite keen to open it up to the floor in a moment. I just want to ask one final sort of quick question. What happens at the end of the 30-year agreement?
Okay, so at the end of the 30-year agreement, the landowner has the choice to step away and do whatever they wish with the land. Obviously, at that point, the land is covered in amazing habitats of very high quality. From an Environment Bank perspective, we would, wherever possible, seek to enter another agreement, re-baseline, potentially look for further enhancements and opportunities with that landowner on that piece of land or other land. From a government policy perspective, what we're expecting is the policy space to change and we're seeing it already, that landowners will then be incentivised to maintain, retain, continue to manage that land in that way, and be rewarded for that through policy, through payments.
Right, I will. The lady here was first, so if you can shout, if we can't hear you, I will repeat your question. So
there might be a mic.
Is there a roving mic that we can use? There is.
There we go.
this lady here. Thank you.
Very much. Jenny Phelps from the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group. Hi there. Sounds like you've got a really good relationship going, which is fantastic. I just wanted to, you have covered some of it about the direct relationship with local authorities, but I just wanted to make people aware of what are the things that are developing directly with local authorities in lots of counties now, which I'm sure you're aware of, which is where county-based trusts are being set up, environmental trusts, not-for-profit trusts, to aggregate biodiversity net gain, working directly with local authorities. And there's a model forming about farmer groups and clusters actually creating their own community interest companies to have direct relationships with those environmental trusts that link to the development of local nature recovery strategies and align with developing carbon markets and all the other policies that are coming on board. And I think that you've done a really brilliant presentation about how your relationship works really well. I mean, you're a private company, at the Environment Bank, and I think that local authorities are slightly concerned sometimes, I know, about the fact that planning mitigation money might get lost by the process, but I can see the role that you play and why that there's a cause for that. But I did think it was important in this session to make people aware that there are developing policies which create direct relationships between farmers and local authorities, aggregating funding and aggregating that opportunity in those markets directly to farmer groups and clusters. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll quickly add to that as well, because we're actually in the North Devon biosphere, and I mean, you might know a guy called Andy Bell who runs the North Devon biosphere, and they're actually creating their own local marketplace because the biosphere itself gains quite a lot of investment in nature recovery because of its status. In the middle of it, there's a UNESCO site, which is Braunton Burrows. For plants, it is absolutely one of the best places I've ever been. But yeah, I think there will be local stuff turning up a lot more, and it's so early on that there's also going to be other, bigger projects like the Wendling Beck that I'm working on, which will pop up, and so who knows where the marketplace will go? But yeah.
I think also it comes down to choice. Giving people choice. It is an open market. We live in a free market society, whether or not we like it. So yeah, absolutely. Many different options. Yes, Lydia.
Oh, thank you. That was so interesting. I have a series of meadows along the river at the bottom of my farm, and I'm about to put in a wetland with the local wildlife trust. And I'm wondering whether it's going to be a problem to have done things which have benefited nature now. And I'm interested in the baselining and, whether you would then say, oh, that's already been improved, so we can't take it on. And the other question was, are there particular sorts of land that you look for, whether it's in an area where there is other good habitat or along a river, that sort of thing? Thanks.
It's a really interesting question, actually, and it's something we often get asked at the CLA. Am I going to be penalised for the good work I've already done? Well, whether that's under environmental stewardship agreements or biodiversity net gain, for example. So, yeah, I'd be interested in the answer to that, actually.
Yeah, so, I mean, first of all, I'd recommend don't do baselining right now, for starters. So the emerging secondary legislation says that projects that have delivered improvements any earlier than January 2020 couldn't be eligible as a biodiversity net gain project. So if you can demonstrate, in a concrete way that your improvements happened after, or some of those improvements happened after January 2020, then you can demonstrate what the baseline was, what the value of biodiversity was at that point. Then you should be able to use that improvement for biodiversity net gain purposes. From our perspective, we can. It doesn't have to be like bare ground, kind of the absolute poorest biodiversity. We are looking for enhancement projects, but we have to demonstrate an uplift. We have to be able to say it was of this condition and now it's this condition, and the bit in between is the product, and we have to be able to demonstrate that. So if we can. And we're taking on woodlands that are already woodlands, but we want to manage them better and improve them. So it's all case by case a little bit. So we could send someone out and check and have a look and see if there's an opportunity there, basically, at our cost.
Thank you. The lady down here.
Thank you very much. Full disclosure, I'm talking to the Environment Bank at the moment about 20 hectares, which will sit inside a bigger piece of land, and so it will be part of a diverse system. But just bringing context in here, because I think it's worthwhile saying we are in a biodiversity crisis and we are in a climate crisis. And so everybody really needs to be framing all their actions against that backdrop, because even though we have to look at the financial bridge to get there, the whole world's infrastructure of finance is going to collapse unless we make this work. And so we all have a responsibility to future generations and to ourselves to be taking this type of action. And so I look at how I can manage to take this action, and looking at the 20 hectares that I've just done a number crunching of comparing against stewardship to what I can get from the EB in terms of numbers, but also in terms of outcomes. And I wouldn't be able to do what I want to do in terms of wildflower meadows, etc., with stewardship. I wouldn't be able to afford it. I can only do it with the Environmental Bank. And it seems everybody I've spoken to, the Environmental Bank, has been really incredibly on it and has exactly the same motivations that I have. So it feels like a really clean, simple solution thus far. So there we go.
Thank you. I did not write that for you.
I'd say there's a plant. Yeah, have you planted someone in the audience? Yeah, quite. Gentleman there with his hand up.
Tom Wood-Alden from Northumberland. Question on the financial front. You said earlier on the £800 to £900 a hectare per year is for rent and management. How much is management and how much is rent? And I suspect it probably varies. And the other question is, the price that you're selling the units to the developers, what's that at and where do you think it's going to go? And also, sorry, is the £900, is that indexed or is it fixed for the 30 years?
Okay, so we have a little bit of flexibility on the split between the rental and the management fees, but typically the rental's based on relative hectare rentals in the local area for agricultural rental. So, typically maybe £200 to £240 a hectare for the rental side, and the rest is the management side. It depends on the types of habitats you're having on site and the types of management actions that are required, and that's why that number will vary a bit. There are 3 questions. Also, index, yes, so it's all fully forward funded, and there's a fixed inflation added annually to the payments, so that goes up annually with that fixed inflation. We have to fix it because we forward fund it, so we have to put that money in the bank on day one. That's why we have to fix it. And the third question was, how much are the credits? So they're definitely going up at the moment. The cost, so Natural England did a kind of initial finger in the air type number a couple of years ago. That's already doubled. But obviously we're in this very emerging market, and market forces will apply. So I think we will start off with them being relatively expensive. Then there'll be more providers in the market, and there'll be a period where it's more saturated, and they'll go down. So we, at the moment, we have an idea of what our costs are, and what we would need to sell them for. We're a commercial business. And we have to pay back that money that goes into that forward fund. We have to pay it back with interest. So we do have to make a margin. But we take on the risk of what that credit price is going to look like. I'm not going to give you a number.
Yeah. Well, I think actually it's for us. I mean, I'm just going to talk about our particular deal because it might help, it might not. So I was particularly worried about the inflationary problem, and the initial offer was quite a low inflationary number across the board for the rent and the management. And what we did was we renegotiated. So we actually took all of the rental income in a lump sum up front. We checked out with our accountant that was okay to take in a lump sum, so we didn't get hammered for income tax immediately. We could essentially defer that as a rental payment over the 30 years, taking that on the books, as it were, at the £235 for us per hectare per year. And then the management payments, we managed to get slightly better inflation over what we got. I think it was 3.5%, which obviously when you look at it now, you're like, oh my God, it's absolutely, we're essentially going backwards. But of course, the reason we ended up kind of going with that is that in this particular environment, looking back at 30 years and potentially hoping that inflation might stabilise at some point, it was likely that was kind of a fair thing. Because obviously the Environment Bank were getting this money up front. There's absolutely no way that they can sort of exceed that by just giving us really, really large inflationary linked increases annually. They couldn't give us 10%. It would be a massive amount of money that would have to go into the escrow for every single landowner. And of course, if inflation drops in 5 years to 1%, they're absolutely going to be taking it on the chin. So we thought, I was hoping for 5. Why not go for it? Looking back 30 years, it's at about 3%, I think, on average. Depends where you start, because there's some pretty high inflation back then at some points in the 90s. If you do it over 10 years, it looks really, really low. So that was the deal we got.
Thank you. Yeah, of course, yeah. We will, apologies, we're going to have to wrap up, unfortunately, because we are running short of time. However, do come up and have a chat afterwards.
Come and have a chat if you have questions.
Absolutely. I'm just going to put one final question to you, though, quickly, 30 seconds each. What can a farmer or land manager do to best prepare or best position themselves to take advantage of upcoming opportunities within environmental markets and BNG in particular?
Well, if you wanted to develop a relationship with us, we cover all the costs and we'll baseline your land and do all of the ecological survey work. But if you want to keep all your options open, baseline, get an ecologist out there, find out what your baseline habitats are and what the opportunities are to improve them, and then you can take that to a number of providers and see what your options are.
I think the best thing to do is to stay very, very aware, stay very astute, keep up with the literature, keep up with the changing scenarios that are going on with policy, and find a land agent that is, if you want to get advice, find a land agent or friend who is innovative. I have had a lot of conversations with land agents who have decided to stay on the fence about all of this, and as a consequence now what is happening is they can't give the advice. And I think that it is imperative that if you're going to gain advice from a professional, that you work out whether they actually know what they're talking about, because a lot of them don't. So in this particular environment, so that's what I would say.
Thank you very much. The other thing you can do, just a very quick CLA plug, we do have a guidance note available on Biodiversity Net Gain and future environmental markets, so you can read up on that. But I'd just like to say thank you to Emma, thank you to Toby. Really fascinating to hear from you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you very much.